Good evening, everybody. I am Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute at American University, and we are so glad that you are able to join us this evening for our newest installment of Women on Wednesdays. We are delighted to have with us here this evening, Cecilia Muñoz. She is currently the Vice President for Public Interest Technology and Local Initiatives, that's quite a title, at New America. Prior to that, she served the full 8 years in the Obama administration, 3 as the Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and 5 as the Director of the Domestic Policy Council, the very first Latina to hold that job. So based on her experience as so often being the first or the only in a room, she has written a terrific new book full of stories, insights, and useful advice for women, including women of color at any point in their career. It's called More Than Ready, Be Strong and Be You, and Other Lessons for Women of Color on the Rise. And we're so happy she's here to share some of those stories and advice with us. For those of you not familiar with Crowdcast, I want to let you know that we're going to save plenty of time for questions. And down at the bottom of your screen, you should see an Ask the Question tab. So we encourage you to write a question there, and you can also upvote other people's questions that you're also interested in. So please take a moment to do that. And then there's a green button also in the middle of the screen. You'll see there's a way to purchase a link to go right to purchase the book. So please do that as well if you haven't read it yet. It also makes a great graduation gift this time of year. So Cecilia, thank you. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So I wanted to start with, can you tell us a little bit about what your inspiration was to write this book?
Yeah, I actually did not walk out of the White House thinking I was going to write a book. I found wonderful work at New America, and I did what women frequently do. I kept my head down and was focused on doing my work. But a couple women in my life really pushed me and said, you know, this is what women do. We let other people do the talking, and we just kind of stay focused on getting the job done. Right. And you can really think about whether you have something to say. And they kind of didn't let it go. And I thought about it. And my first reaction was what women do, right? I had the voice kind of on my shoulder saying, oh, you know, who are you to, what would you have to say that anybody would be interested in? But then I realized that I do a lot of public speaking. I travel all around the country. And I tell the same stories from across my career because they're the stories that resonate. And invariably, when I'm done speaking, someone comes up to me afterwards, and 100% of the time, that person is a woman. And most of the time, that woman is a woman of color. And she'll say something to me like, that thing you said about being afraid or about that time when you doubted yourself, that was me. And thank you for saying that because I thought I was the only one. And in a way, it was those women who made me think, oh, of course I have something to say. And in fact, I say it all the time. So I had to give, once I gave myself permission to believe that I had something to contribute, I knew it was going to be in all 10 chapters of the book. It felt like almost like it wrote itself as soon as I crossed the threshold into remembering that, of course, I have something to contribute. And that's, in some ways, that's part of the lesson of the book, is that we undervalue our own leadership. We undervalue our own voices. And we can't afford to do that anymore, not just for our own sakes, but because the country kind of needs us right now.
So take us back to, you said at your heart, you're really a policy nerd. Yeah. How did you decide to make a difference through policy? And then let us know what propelled your movement in from working on civil rights and immigration rights into actually having a career in policy.
So it was by accident. I finished graduate school feeling very certain that my destiny was to work at a social service organization. That's what I really wanted to do. And I actually was fortunate that I moved to Chicago and found work at a social service organization. And the picture in my head was I would be one of those people at an organization where clients come in and you provide them with services. And we did a good job. But I discovered that it wasn't for me. I agonized all the time about the people that we couldn't help. And so I was once interviewed by a newspaper reporter, and I described my job as, it's like watching people being pushed off a cliff knowing that you can only help some of them, which is not what someone who is in love with their job sounds like. So I but I discovered in that work that the clients that we were serving had advocacy needs, and that I was good at helping meet their advocacy needs. I was good at describing the situations that they were in that needed to be changed. So I found my voice as an advocate, and that took me into the policy world. I ended up as an immigration specialist at what was then called the National Council of La Raza, which is the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization. I started at NCLR in 1988, and I was there for 20 years. And it was in my work there that I met then Senator Obama, and because there was an immigration bill, the same one that we're still trying to pass, by the way, going through the Senate. And he wanted to learn about the issues, and so he would call in experts, including me. And that's how I got to know him. So I caught the policy bug kind of by accident and I'd like to tell this story, especially to people early in their careers, because I think it's valuable to know that sometimes you can set a course and you think you're going in one direction, and you try it out and discover that actually your real course is in a different direction. And that's totally legitimate and important, actually.
And so you knew him when he was a senator. He wins election as president. And you get quite the phone call. Most people pull every string possible to get their resume in front of the right person at the White House. You not so much. Tell us that story.
So he was elected in 2008. I, supported his campaign, but as a volunteer. Unlike many of the people that I worked with who gave up their lives and lived in their cars in Iowa, I was, a volunteer helping with policy advice, with Latino outreach advice. And I was very certain that you needed good people on the inside and good people on the outside, and that I was destined to be one of the good people on the outside. And in 2008, my mother passed away. I had teenage daughters, and I was just very focused on, savoring my time with them and being the best mom that I could be. So I was not angling for a White House job. I got called in for an interview. And the reason that I went in for the interview was because I wanted to know what Rahm Emanuel had to say about immigration reform. And I figured, this is a low risk interview because I don't actually want the job, and I get to find out what they're thinking. So I was very honest and said, in a second term, if you are interested, I would love to come because my kids will be grown, but not now. And I got a call saying, this was Jim Messina, who was to be the deputy chief of staff, and he said, "I have really bad news for you. We really want you to take this job." And I said, "No, thank you." And he said, "I don't think this is over." And I thought, oh, come on, of course it's over. There are a million wonderful people who want these jobs. And the next day, I was driving my daughter after school, and my cell phone rang, and it was a Chicago number. And I thought, oh, uh-oh. It was Rahm. And he said, we're going to make this a family-friendly White House. And then he said, "Can you hang on for a moment?" And the next words I hear were, "This is Barack Obama, and I'm not taking no for an answer." And to this day, I still don't understand why that happened. But it did. And to my astonishment, I found myself working in government, and I stayed for 8 years. And I'm incredibly glad that I did. I mean, it's easily, except for being a parent, it's the hardest thing I've ever done. But it also among the most amazing. It was an extraordinary experience.
And did you find that it was a family-friendly place, or was Rahm just selling you a bill of goods there?
It was a little bit of a bill of goods. I mean, that's not to say that they didn't try.
Right, but you certainly weren't in the carpool line every day.
Right, but we got laptops, and the parents got them first.
Yeah.
And there was a family leave policy for people who had kids that was available to men and women, and men and women took it when their babies were born. And that was a big development for the White House. So there were some important strides forward in the Obama years, but no, we worked 16-hour days. And, the advice I got, this was from John Podesta, was because he told me, he said, "I know you're worried about your family." He said, "I had kids in high school when I was chief of staff for President Clinton. And here's how it works. If you get one thing besides work, and if that thing is your family, great, then you've chosen. Then you don't get any other thing. You're not going to go to movies. You're not going to go to concerts. That choir you sing in, you're not singing in it. And you're not going to see your friends. And, but you will see your kids if they're the thing that you choose." And he was right about that. I really, for those 8 years, I worked, I saw family, I exercised, I ate, I slept.
Yeah. Well, we had Valerie on with us, Valerie Jarrett, last week, and she said a similar thing. And she made the point that, at the end of the day, if there was a major event if your kid was in a recital or something like that, you made that work.
Yes.
Just wasn't the everyday sort of.
That's right. And she was my boss for the first 3 years. And she said to me, we're going to work really hard, but I promise you, you won't miss anything important. And she was as good as her word. But I always knew that if there was a recital or a thing, that I could go and do it, and she would have my back, and she did.
You write about in the book about being tested, the times you actually know you're being tested and that your colleagues are watching. And this happened to you early on in the administration, President Obama's very first State of the Union address. No pressure there. Tell us that story about how you felt you were being tested and how you made your voice heard in that process. Yeah,
so this is the thing that happens when you are the only person of your kind in the room, right? So I was the senior most Hispanic person. I'm an expert on immigration policy. I know that the president wants me to watch his back on immigration policy. And this is his first State of the Union address, and it's in the middle of the economic crisis. You know, we still hadn't bounced back. And so the pressure on him was to demonstrate to the country that he was on the case on the economy. And the immigration world literally expected like a whole section of the speech. So I was getting emails and calls from people who were like, here are the 5 points we want him to make on immigration. And I'm thinking, wow, I hope there's a sentence on immigration. I know there isn't going to be a section. And when I saw the draft, there was a sentence fragment, but it only talked about immigration enforcement. And I knew that that was going to be a problem. So so David Axelrod is the gatekeeper for the speech. And so I shoot him a note that says, this is really only half of what he has to say. There's another half here. And poor David had everybody coming at him.
Incoming from everywhere.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So the test is, the thing that's going through his head is she going to be the person who helps us deliver the speech that the president needs to deliver? Or is she going to be the gadfly who's just pushing on the Latino piece all the time?
Right.
And I'm very aware that this is the test, right? And that how I manage this thing for the president is not just about the sentence in the speech. It's about, am I the gadfly or am I a teammate with some expertise, but who's ultimately about what the team needs to do to support the president? So I march down to David's office and I say, I think we can fix this. Here's how we do it. And as soon as he sees it's a sentence that he could work with, it was fine and it was over. And we got the sentence right and I had passed the test. But I face that kind of thing all the time. And this is true for people of color, and it's true for women, especially if you're the only one in the room. There's this constant calibration of, am I pushing too hard? And pretty soon everybody's going to tune me out.
Right.
Am I not pushing hard enough, and therefore I'm not fulfilling my responsibility here? I have to do that calibration constantly, and that's true for women, and it's true for women of color especially. And I interviewed 7 women of color as I was preparing this book, and they all said the same thing. It's just a constant calibration.
You write about some setbacks along the way and things you learned from them. And speaking of immigration, the DREAM Act, many successes that you had, but this was the end of 2010 and the DREAM Act failed in the Senate. And you learned and wrote about a lesson from Obama during that about taking the long view on things.
Yeah, it was December 2010. It was a Saturday. And there were 2 votes up that day in the lame duck session in the Congress. The first was the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which succeeded. And then the next vote was the DREAM Act, which failed by 5 votes. And we had 11 Republicans in the Senate at the time who had previously voted for it. Some of it had been original sponsors of the DREAM Act. We didn't need all of them, but we only got 3, and we lost by 5 votes. And the team, both teams, the Don't Ask, Don't Tell team and the DREAM Act team, were assembled in my office watching these votes. And, we were in tears, happy tears for one reason and sad tears for another. And I think Valerie must have tipped off the president that we were up there, because my office was on the 2nd floor, and he came up. And, we're all kind of mopping our faces and drying our eyes. And he said, now, remember that it took 17 years to get to this victory on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That's a long time, and there were defeats along the way to this victory. So I understand that you're upset, and I understand that this feels terrible. but understand that this is a defeat on the way to the victory, which will surely come. And remember that you played a part in it, and dust yourselves off and let's get back to work. And he, obviously it still hasn't happened, and we were waiting for a Supreme Court decision any day now on DACA.
Mm.
But in the end, he was right, that you have to take the long view. You have to understand that there are defeats on the way to victory. And your job is to give it all you have all the time. And, I reflect in the book on the movements that accomplished huge things, like the suffragist movement that, amended the Constitution so that women have the vote. Obviously, the abolitionist movement. There were people who, those movements started a century or more before the victory came.
Right.
It means that there were generations of people who fought for a thing that they never lived to see. But their fight mattered. And you have to have the capacity to keep the faith during that fight, even if you can't see the finish line. And I am the beneficiary of that, of the women who fought, even though they never saw suffrage. And our country is a beneficiary of the people who fought for the end of slavery, even though they didn't live to see it. And so those fights are important. And I learned from the president to take the long view. And I tell a story in the book of learning from Ted Kennedy also to find joy in the fight, even when you lose. And I think that's important because these are, you want to try to do this work over a lifetime, and it means you're going to have a lot of losses, and you can't let it make you pack up and go home.
Right.
These are historic, epic fights, and your part in them really matters.
One of the other successes you all had was passing the Affordable Care Act in 2010, but then came the website fiasco, healthcare.gov, which we will never forget. But you write about learning from mistakes during that and being willing and able to adjust, and how the end result of that actually ended up being beneficial to a lot of other places in the government. Can you talk a little bit about that story and what you all learned from that? Because you were involved in the fix.
Yes. That slide just gives me total PTSD.
Sorry about that.
It was a very painful moment. For 3 weeks, that website didn't work. But I give a lot of credit to the president, to Dennis McDonough, who was the chief of staff. We didn't just fix the website and then 20 million people got healthcare, by the way.
Right. But
also we learned from what had happened. We didn't just dust ourselves off once we fixed it and move on. We asked hard questions about, all right, what does this teach us about what government is good at and not good at? And we learned we didn't have an engineering problem. We have a management problem. Government is not great at the kind of stuff that the Silicon Valley does every day before breakfast. So, you and I would have an easier time right now ordering a pair of shoes on our phones than we would getting a replacement for our Social Security cards, for example. And there's no reason that has to be true. So we developed something called the U.S. Digital Service. Because I was the domestic policy advisor at the time, I got to place these, hotshots from the Silicon Valley who were doing a tour of duty doing public service when in the federal agencies when we were trying to solve big problems. And the results were utterly transformational. And in fact, the work that I do now at New America is based on that experience. We're trying to build a field of public interest technology, which is entirely based on what we learned from the experience of bringing digital skills, the skills of technologists, to government. And the U.S. Digital Service still exists. It's still kind of revolutionizing how government works, even in this administration. And that experience is being replicated over and over again in state governments and local governments, not fast enough. But the work that I do is about helping that happen more and helping train people. If I think we will have succeeded if somebody, say, in middle school right now says, I want to be a computer scientist or a programmer or an engineer because I want to end homelessness. If we understand that we can use that skill set to solve public problems, then we will have been successful.
You also have a section in the book titled "When People Assume You're Only There for Color." And you write about your promotion to the head of the Domestic Policy Council, a big job, senior level job. Yeah. And it was clear to you that a small number of your colleagues saw you as a person who owed your position to your ethnicity and didn't take seriously what you actually brought to the job. And one such person you later learned was your ultimate boss. There's Valerie Jarrett, but the chief of staff, Bill Daley. Yeah. And you write very frankly about that experience and talk about the strategies that you have for sort of dealing with doubt.
Yeah. So, and I tell the story in the book not to dime out Bill Daley, who was
right.
a dedicated public servant, but because this is a very common experience for people of color and for women, and for women of color especially. So Bill was the chief of staff when I was promoted to domestic policy advisor, and he left the White House about a month later. And he told two people who were writing books about the first term that he was disappointed that I had been promoted to that job, that he'd recommended other people for it. And that both of those authors got the impression that I was an affirmative action hire and maybe not so qualified for my role. And that cost me a couple of years of confidence, frankly, because I would then go in and sit at the senior staff table every morning and think, well, shoot, if that's what Bill thought, how do I know that that's not what everybody else around this table thinks? And that is it's a common experience, which is why I tell the story. And the women that I spoke to all had experiences like that, where people will say to you, yeah, we all know why you're here. And that it's obviously doubt coming from the outside, but it also leads to self-doubt. But we also all develop the same strategies for dealing with that doubt. The first of which is to over-prepare. So that, the title of my book is More Than Ready, which refers to the notion that the world is more than ready for the leadership that we bring. But it also refers to the fact that when we doubt ourselves, when we can sense that other people doubt us, we buckle down and do the work, and we make sure we are ready, and we make sure we're not going to make a mistake. Because when you make a mistake, it's not just a mistake, right? It's a reflection on people like us. And so one of our strategies is to prepare. One of the women I interviewed called it being superbly prepared all the time. And another strategy that we adopt is to seek feedback. And Valerie Jarrett, who's up on the screen, is one of the people that I knew that I could trust. And so I quite deliberately sought out people who I felt comfortable with, who I felt would not hold it against me that I was asking for feedback, and who I knew would give me honest feedback. And Valerie was one of them. So I could go in her office and close the door and say, that meeting didn't go well. Help me figure out why, and help me figure out what I need to do to do this better. And I've learned, it feels like a very dangerous thing to do, to ask for feedback. I've learned to see it as a sign of strength, not as a sign of weakness, because the signal you are sending is, first of all, these are hard jobs. And the signal you're sending is, I'm trying to up my game. And you know what? We can all stand to up our game. So there's no shame in that. But I also was careful about who I asked for feedback.
Right. Another chief of staff that you write about was Obama's first chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, and you mentioned him earlier, talking to you about taking the job. But he is known for his rather, let's say, abrasive leadership style.
Yeah.
And he seemed to help you get over the notion of fear. Yep. After this headline appeared on the front page of the New York Times in April 9th, 2009, Obama to push immigration bill as one priority. And tell us what happened and what you faced in sort of the morning meeting from Rahm that next morning.
So that doesn't seem like such a terrible headline, does it?
No.
And in fact, the president himself had talked about how the reason he hired me is because he wanted to pass an immigration bill. But at the time, 2009 was economic downturn, and Rahm was, as he should be, very, very focused on having one message every day, and the message was about bringing the economy back online. So I had a fully sanctioned conversation with a reporter where I repeated something that the president had said, and the reporter was like, wait, what? He wants to do immigration? That's crazy. And I could tell that this was going to be a headline, and it wasn't going to be the headline that we wanted. So every morning there was a meeting at 8:30 in the morning in the Roosevelt Room, which is a few steps from the Oval Office. That was chaired by Rahm, and the senior staff was around the table, and everybody had to report. And Rahm would frequently ream somebody out at that meeting in front of 30 of their colleagues. So when I saw that headline, I knew, oh, all right, today's going to be my day, because this is not the headline that he wanted. And I slid into my seat that morning and sat next to Valerie, and I said, how much trouble am I in? And she said, so much trouble. And sure enough, he, lit into me the way I'd seen him light into other colleagues. And so that morning meeting was a terrifying meeting, because everybody had to report. If you didn't have something to report, you could get yelled at. And sometimes you got yelled at for other things. And so everybody, I think, approached that meeting with a certain degree of fear and apprehension. But the fact of the matter is, my day in the hot seat was kind of liberating, because I knew it was coming. So it was 3 minutes of extreme discomfort in front of everybody. And then I thought, oh, okay, so the thing I feared the most in this meeting just happened. And now we're all getting up and we're going about our business for the day. And I didn't get fired. And I have 14 hours worth of meetings to go to. And I never had fear again after that, because I realized the fear part is really imaginary. Mm-hmm. And I found, and the strategy that I recommend in the book is, if you're feeling it, play out the worst thing that could happen. So I really did. I thought, okay, he's going to yell at me. Maybe I'll get fired. What happens if I get fired? What's that going to look like? I'm going to pack up my office. I'm going to walk out of the building. I'm going to go home to my truly wonderful family, who's going to love me anyway. And people might look at me funny for a while, and that might be uncomfortable, but I'm going to, go on and live my life, and it'll be okay. And it completely defangs the fear. And I actually owe that to Rahm Emanuel, who, again, is a totally dedicated and really talented public servant, but he's abrasive, famously so.
So speaking of Rahm, you write about this being a very cutthroat, male-dominated environment, and that you took up swearing. I'm showing a picture of not the male-dominated environment, some actually great female colleagues that you worked with. But how did you develop those strategies for not only being tough, but then you write about also being kind as being so important, and your propensity you write about for taking up swearing, and why maybe you did that as you reflect on it now?
Yeah. So this photo, I love this photo. And I will tell you that as much as the White House gets dimed out is a very male environment, in the second term, most of the White House offices were run by women,
right?
In the Obama administration. And the male environment that I describe in the book was when I got to Washington in 1988. Most of the circle of immigration advocates that I entered was very, very male. And it turns out most of them were also tall, and I'm 5'. And this is a thing that I think women do in a variety of ways. This is not just the fact that it was the late 1980s. I think it's still true. In my case, I'm short, I'm a Latina, I'm pretty soft-spoken. And at that, in 1988, I was in my 20s. And I assumed that the guys were just not going to see any toughness by my physical appearance, that they were just, that's not what they were going to see when I walked into a room. And so I felt I had to convey it in some way. So I quite deliberately took up swearing, because it's the way they operated. It's not how I was raised. But I felt like I needed to do it in order to be taken seriously. And that's one example of a million things that women still do in order to be accepted, in order to show toughness. And there's a whole chapter in my book called In Defense of Kindness, which kind of focuses on this, because the way we have understood leadership has been developed over generations of leaders, and most of those leaders have been men. And so we have an ingrained sense of what a leader sounds like, what he looks like, how a leader behaves. And if a man, as you can see President Obama, yeah. That was my birthday. If a man behaves with kindness as a leader, that's kind of an extra. He gets points for it. But if a woman shows up with kindness, people think she's a pushover, people think she's weak, and people might also think maybe not so smart, maybe not so tough. And that's been true. That's happened to me my whole life. But the other thing that's true is that kindness is a leadership quality. We just don't value it that way. We don't see it that way. And some of the women that I spoke to, particularly the African-American women, felt like they had to hide their kindness under a bushel lest people take advantage of them. And, I reflected hard on what made me successful as President Obama's domestic policy advisor. And I was in that job for 5 years, longer than anybody in history. And part of what made me successful is that I have empathy. I can read a room. Mm-hmm. I know what people need in order to feel like they've carried their part of the argument. And even if they don't win the argument, they can abide by the result because they were heard. And that turns out to be a really valuable skill set. We just don't think of it as a leadership quality, but it is. And look around the world now at the countries that are succeeding against this virus. They tend to be led by women, and there's a empathy on display.
Well, speaking of that, we have a great first question here, and I had this on my list of things to ask you as well, but let me ask you from Andrea. She says, before you headed the President's Domestic Policy Council, you served as the White House Director of Intergovernmental Affairs when the nation was undergoing an economic crisis of historic proportions. At a time when the country is facing COVID-19 and a 15% unemployment rate, what reflections can you share on leadership during a crisis? And recommendations do you have for policymakers, be it lawmakers or the administration? You all faced the economic crisis, the Gulf oil spill, H1N1. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. We used to joke that we'd seen everything but a plague of locusts. And, there are times when you just have to let all politics go. And a pandemic is one of those times. The oil spill was one of those times. There were lots of those times where your job, first and foremost, is about the safety and security of the American people. And to use the oil spill as an example, right? This went on for months. It was horrible. Valerie Jarrett and I were on the phone with the Gulf state governors, all 5 of whom were Republicans, every single day, 7 days a week, every morning, to make sure that they were getting what they need. One of those governors was Haley Barbour, who had been the chair of the RNC. This is a political animal. And I have great respect for Haley Barbour because not once did he play politics during the oil spill. He understood his job was governing in that moment and that we were going to be useful to him because our job was also governing in that moment. And I have enormous respect for that. And that's kind of the core course requirement when you are in government, especially in a moment of crisis. Is you have to do the most effective job of serving the people, and you don't think about whether those people are in red states or blue states. You do think about where there are disparities in access to things like vaccines, because your job is to serve all the people. And I say that with a fair amount of grief because that's so not the way that this current administration is behaving.
Okay, let's see. We have another question here. Here's one from Melissa. She says, I'm a proud Latina. What advice do you have for first-generation Latinas who often face societal litmus tests about their race and ethnicity? As you know, many first-generation children are encouraged to assimilate as a result, can lose close connection to their culture, such as language. I sometimes feel like I am in the awkward place of either being too Latina or not Latina enough, depending on the environment.
I know this place very well. And I think it's a great, great, great question. And so many of us are in the position of being firsts, right? The first in your family to go to college, the first Hispanic person in your job, the first woman in the kind of job that you're having, the only one in the room. Like whatever form this takes, it can be constant, and it can be a constant source of calibration. And this is part of the reason I wrote the book, is to communicate how important it is to know that what you bring into the room is valuable, no matter what. Your lived experience is incredibly important to the people you are in the room with. Now, they may or may not know that they need you and what you bring, but they do, and it's important that you know that. There's so much data now about how diverse teams make better decisions, and if you bring different perspectives into a room, you're going to make wiser decisions, you're going to have better impact. So there's lots of evidence to show it. But I've learned that sometimes we hold ourselves back because we hear other people's doubts. We have self-doubt. If you've never seen somebody like you in a role, then you feel like you're inventing it and you wonder whether or not you belong. And so the key is to walk in with a clear North Star, with your compass set, and with clarity that what you bring really matters and that your job is to bring it effectively.
Great. Just want to remind you guys, if you have other questions, please go to the Ask a Question tab and submit your question there. We have another great question from Andrea. She says, how did your experience and expertise advocating for people of color and low-income communities inform your leadership at the White House?
So this is also a great question. So I spent 20 years in the civil rights movement before I got to the White House, and I amassed a lot of experience there. And I mean, in some ways, this is still a thing that I'm doing, although I'm now at a think tank in Washington. Mm-hmm. The decisions that affect us are being made, by and large, by a too homogenous a group of people who don't know us all, and sometimes don't know some of us at all. And part of our job is to become those people, right? To make sure that the decision makers really reflect the whole country and the vast diversity of who we are. So I learned a lot about how to do that just from the experience of doing, for most of my career, my job at NCLR, which is now called Unidos US, was kind of about, I think of it as Latinos 101, explaining to policymakers who we are. We're the largest minority in the country. And we're still mysterious to way too many people, or misunderstood to way too many people who are making policy. So part of the job is to make sure that policymakers understand, that the media understands what they're talking about. But another part of the job, and this is work that I'm very deeply engaged in now, is making sure that the people who are affected by the policy decisions that we make are involved in the design of the policy to begin with. If you look at the CARES Act, which Congress just passed to try to get resources to the people who are hurting in this crisis, as many as half of the people who are supposed to be helped, who Congress intended to help, aren't getting the help for a variety of reasons. But one of those reasons is because folks in Congress didn't understand that they're unbanked, or they're people who don't earn enough to file taxes. And so the mechanisms that they were counting on to deliver those resources don't work for those people. And so that's among the many reasons it's incredibly important to bring the experience of the community that you're trying to affect into the design of policymaking in the first place, because otherwise we're not going to accomplish what we set out to accomplish.
Great. Let's see. Here's a question from Julie. She says, which young women or Latina women are you expecting big things from, for example, AOC?
So, I'm very excited about her leadership. I honestly, the mother in me worries that the spotlight is shining so brightly on her, and I think that's really hard. I think that's just super, super challenging. She's handling it with really quite extraordinary grace. I also, have colleagues from my days in the Obama administration that I am, that I learned so much from and who I am watching rise in their own ways. So Stephanie Valencia, who is now running an organization called X Labs, which is providing data on the Latino community, particularly the Latino electorate, that is much more detailed than anything the political press has ever seen. Now, keep your eye on her. Julie Rodriguez, who is just announced by the Biden campaign as an advisor to the vice president, is an extraordinary leader. She's one of the best organizers I've ever met. There are, I could go on and on. There are extraordinary young leaders coming up in the community, and I couldn't be more thrilled about it. And frankly, they're, so much better than I was, or anybody around me was at their stage, which is just what we need, thank goodness.
So we're all for women running for office here at the Women in Politics Institute. So I have to ask you, what about your future? Do you think you would ever run for office?
No, I am kind of a classic behind the scenes policy nerd. So I like working for the folks who run for office. I like, connecting with the folks who are elected officials. I loved my experience in government, and I'm honored to have served as an appointee. But I am happiest when I'm in the weeds of politics.
Okay, we have another question here. Thank you for sharing. What advice would you give to someone who is looking for a mentor? And I'll also add there, you do talk about that in the book, and you talk about that you don't have to be in an advanced stage of your career to actually be a mentor or help somebody else with their career.
Yeah, that's exactly right. One of the interesting things that I learned in the process of writing the book was how many women of color that I know said things to me like, every time a door is opened for me, it's because a woman of color stood up for me every single time, which is kind of extraordinary. And so what that says is we have to be constantly watching out for each other, constantly having each other's backs, constantly lifting each other up. And you can do it for someone coming up behind you as a mentor, providing advice and being available for that sort of thing. And I think it's totally okay to ask people for advice. I get asked for advice, and I consider it an honor when people ask. So don't be shy about asking, but also don't assume that you have to have climbed the ladder before you can be a person who is helping lifting up your colleagues. So, for example, the very first time I testified in Congress, I was 26 years old. And there were a couple women in the back of the room who had been trailblazers themselves in the labor movement and in the legal profession. And they called my boss and said, we know you weren't able to be there, but we were there, and she did a really good job. And I didn't find out about that till long after the fact. But this was women watching out for the other women in the room.
And it took them, 5 seconds to do that?
It was a little teeny part of their day, but it made an enormous difference. And there's no reason somebody early in their career can't do that. And, be in a meeting with somebody and shoot a note to their boss or to their coworkers and say, you know what, she was really shining today. Like, you've got a star on your hands. That makes an enormous difference. Yeah. And there is such a difference. And I have to say that Valerie Jarrett actually really helped set this tone in the White House. You can be in environments where people are competing with each other for attention and for primacy. And the tone Valerie set was, no, we're actually going to lift each other up. We're not going to be those people. We're going to create an environment where I'm communicating. If you are successful, then the enterprise is successful, and that's my success too. And I'm a big believer in modeling the behavior that you hope to inspire in your colleagues. And that includes sharing credit, lifting each other up.
Okay, here's another great question. Can you share one instance where having the input from a diverse team contributed to a better decision? I'm sure you have a bunch of examples.
Oh, yeah. One of the stories has to do with when the current president first announced his candidacy, which was at a point where a lot of folks in the political class weren't taking him seriously. And then we were having a conversation around the senior staff table. You'll remember that President Trump very famously, when he announced his candidacy, referred to people from Mexico as rapists. Mm-hmm. And we had a conversation about, should President Obama step forward and say something about that? And at the time, the conventional wisdom was, this is a primary. They're all going to eat each other alive. Let's let them do that and stay out of the fray. And I was uncomfortable with that. And I was the only Hispanic person in the room. And I wasn't able to explain myself particularly clearly in the sense that, I said what I needed to say, but I could tell people it didn't resonate with people. And I struggled with that. And so I became the person who, for me, it was important to explain to my colleagues that this wasn't just a matter of politics and political maneuvering, that people were going to get hurt as a result of this kind of rhetoric. And it took me a while to figure out how to convey my point in a way that they could hear. And I witnessed some of my colleagues during Ferguson, again, good people who were working for President Obama, like people who believed in civil rights, who believed in reforming the criminal justice system and the way policing happened. But because they themselves had never experienced police violence because they were white, learned something about what happens to other people. And were good enough to say it out loud, like, you know what? I had one colleague say, I didn't know about the talk. I didn't know that African-American parents have to sit their sons down and talk about how to keep themselves safe. Mm-hmm. That's the kind of thing you learn when you're in a diverse environment. And you need both to be the people who can express those things when we're in the room with people who don't understand them, as well as to be the people who are listening, because every single one of us brings our own experience to the table. And by definition, our experience does not duplicate the experience of other people.
Great. Let's see. Another good question from Andrea here. As the immigrant rights community awaits a Supreme Court decision on DACA, what reflections can you share on the use of executive power on immigration during the Obama administration?
I agonize about this all the time. So President Obama was under a ton of pressure from the community to put forward executive actions on immigration, which he ultimately did. He resisted for years. And the reason he resisted was this, right? That only Congress has the power to make permanent change that people needed. And at that point, a congressional debate on immigration reform was possible. We passed the bill through the Senate in 2015. We have, Speaker Boehner was still communicating to the president that he intended to get it done. Ultimately, the speaker never brought up a bill, which is why it was at that moment, the day that Speaker Boehner called him and said, yeah, it's not going to happen, is the day that the president called in his team and said, okay, let's prepare executive action. I worry that Congress has been so dysfunctional that sometimes the advocacy community just gives up on the legislative process. And I understand it because it's really frustrating. But in order to make lasting change, we got to go through the legislative process. And that means organizing at every level. It means making sure that we elect the Congress that we need. But it's a long and heavy slog sometimes. I've been working on immigration reform, this iteration of immigration reform for more than 20 years. Executive actions by definition aren't permanent, and we're living with the results.
I want to ask you also, as we look ahead to this election, what advice you have for especially young women of color, to become more politically engaged in the process, and the power that you think that the Latino community specifically has in organizing and as we look toward 2020 here?
Yeah, so look up Stephanie Valencia's research in X Labs, and you will find that Latinas women, Hispanic women, could determine the outcome of this election. And not just in places like Florida, but in places like Michigan, which is where I'm from. We hold the future of this country in our hands. Women do, for sure. And far too few of us actually participate. And if we can change that, we can change everything by a lot. And if this moment of crisis teaches us anything, it's revealing disparities that have been there for a long time, but which are literally costing people their lives. We can change that by participating, by showing up, by believing in our capacity to make change. I know this to be true. It's not just that the statistical evidence demonstrates that it's true. I've also seen it happen. When Barack Obama first ran for president, it's not even clear to me that he knew he could win. But he did because people showed up who had never showed up before. And it happened twice. And we haven't stopped being that place that could elect someone like him twice. But it requires us believing in our capacity to engage and to own our own democracy.
Great. Let's see. One more question here. Let's see. Given COVID-19, what is your view of the role of government in responding to the risks faced by essential workers across our food supply chain, from farm workers to meatpacking workers to grocery stores?
So, this is a great question.
Yeah.
My organization, New America, did an analysis of the workers that the government has classified as essential workers and found that 40% of them don't earn a living wage, which means they don't earn $15 an hour. 40% of the people on whom our very lives depend don't earn a living wage. And they are going to work every day, very frequently without sufficient equipment, and they are getting sick and dying at higher rates, which is utterly unacceptable. So, the role of government here should start with making sure that they have proper equipment to do their jobs safely. It should start with making sure that they earn, like we're having a conversation about hazard pay. What about a conversation about a minimum wage to make sure that, again, people who are doing jobs which are utterly essential in this crisis can do it in a way that sustains their family and is safe for them. The government, our economic system, has utterly failed these folks. And that's been true for a long time. we're just seeing it with new eyes now. And, the world that we're going into on the other side of this crisis is not going to be the same as the world that we left.
Right.
But it's our job to determine what that world is and how that economy functions and who it functions for.
Mm-hmm. I want to also ask you, what career advice do you have for that women need to hear more of that we don't hear often enough?
That we wait until we're completely sure that we have all of the requirements and all of the skill sets, and we are, I think, too cautious to assert ourselves, to throw ourselves into the fray. We undervalue what we bring more than we should. And I think the world is worse for it. I've really come to that conclusion that, my little tiny version of it is the process of deciding to write a book and concluding that my voice was significant enough to raise, is my little version of that. But I think many of us go through a similar version where we think, oh, what do I know? Oh, what do I have to contribute to this democracy? Who would vote for somebody like me? The answer is a lot of people. And we need to develop the confidence to throw ourselves in a little more because the country really needs us. Really, really needs us.
And how about young women who want to get more involved in policy like yourself? What does that sort of entrance ramp look like?
So at least for me, it's less about the formal requirements than it is about the experience. So my policy credentials come from having worked in my own community and delivering services and working with immigrants. I was able to speak with authority about a constituency that I knew a lot about, which turns out to be just as valuable as going to policy school or going to law school and having that kind of training. I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a graduate of a policy program. Those skills are important too, but community experience is incredibly valuable and it is way too lacking in the policymaking process. So don't assume you have to have a certain kind of resume in order to make a difference. If there's something that excites you, volunteer experience can be as valuable. That's actually how I started. I started as a volunteer in graduate school, helping an organization that was providing services to immigrants. I do a lot of hiring, and the people who are looking for something to put on their resume feel very different in an interview than the people who are in love with the thing that they want to do. And those are the people who shine, and those are the people that I hire. So I think the key for someone starting out is to find the work that doesn't just feel important, but that feels like it's yours to do because you're excited about it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great note to end on. I want to let everybody know that we have a couple of great programs coming up over the next 2 weeks. We have next week, we are doing a kind of an election watch to talk about the Republican women running for office. There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of weeks that more and more Republican women are running this time in 2020. So we're going to talk to Congresswoman Susan Brooks. She's the recruitment chair for the NRCC, and also Parker Poling, who is the executive director. So they will share with us sort of the landscape that they see and talk about some Republican women to watch. And then we are going to, the next week, talk to someone whom I'm sure Cecilia knows well. He's a good friend of ours, Patricia Marshall, who was the chief of protocol for President Obama. And she has a new book out called The Power of Diplomacy, How to Make It Work for You. So we will have her here the week after. So we hope you all join us for that. And I just want to thank Cecilia so much for all of your insights and your stories and your terrific book. And I can see from the comments that everybody took a lot away from it. So we really appreciate your time this evening. And it was great to see you.
Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to everybody for participating.
Great.
Fun.
Yes, good to see everyone and have a great week. We'll see you next week, hopefully.
Thank you.
Bye.